Casey Smith here, Communications Director at Harbor Network, and welcome to the first ever episode of This is Harbor Network, a podcast formerly known as This is Sojourn Network. While the name of our network and the name of this podcast have changed, the goal and mission hasn't. So join us on the journey as we chronicle the lives and stories of pastors and church leaders partnering together to launch, lead, and multiply thriving churches across the U.S. To celebrate and commemorate new beginnings, today, Ronnie Martin is joined by our new Director of Church Planning and Multiplication, Ed Marcelle. They talk about Ed coming to faith, his Catholic upbringing, his love for Albany, New York, and what ultimately led him to Harbor Network. It's a great conversation, so stay with us.
Ed, it's so good to talk with you, brother, and in a lot of ways, really just introduce you to our network as our Director of Church Planting. So, man, I've been looking forward to this, and I'm sure a lot of people are looking forward to hearing a little bit of your story, as well as just some vision and where you see church plantings going with our network and how you see your place in that. Hey, give us a little bit of a snapshot, maybe something that sticks out to you about your origin story, about how you came to know Jesus.
Well, I grew up in the Northeast. I was actually born right in the heart of Barna's most unchurched cities list in Albany, New York. And I grew up in a Catholic family. My dad was an immigrant from Italy, and my mom was Irish American, so pretty much genetically Catholic without any choice at that point. It didn't mean a whole lot of probably what it would mean to someone very devout. I think my mother's side was much more go to church and be a part of it. My father was much more high holy days. So I would have said I was raised very morally, hardworking people who believed there was good, but I didn't know God. And that became very obvious to me when my dad died. And I can remember being 20 years old and a college sophomore and thinking, is this it, right? You're looking at the guy who resembles you, who sired you into this world, and it's over. And I'm trying to figure so many things out at that point. Because I was Catholic, I assumed I had tried Christianity. I just sort of wrote off every other version because I thought these are Johnny-come-lately versions. I've tried the original in my mindset, right? So right. I began reading. I just jumped ship and started reading things like Camus and Sartre to try to find answers, and the Bhagavad Gita to try to find answers. And I ended up just kind of leaving the country, literally hitching around, and came back just more tired, more burned out, and a whole lot more cynical, thinking, well, I can't find answers. And I would say before my conversion, Ronnie, I would describe myself as a fundamentalist agnostic. I would have told anyone who would listen, you cannot know. And whether you say you're an atheist or a theist, I think you're just being arrogant because no one can know. I met a young lady who is my wife, Diane. At that point, she was just a young lady I liked who was a hostess at a Mexican restaurant in Albany. And she had just become a Christian. And she was telling me about her faith. And she was really hard to write off because it was one so vibrant. I mean, I can still remember it all these years later. To this day, she's still the one who is not talking office, talking gift, certainly more pastoral than I am. I might have vision and apostolic gifts, but she's the one who has shown me over 31 years of marriage what the love of Jesus looks like lived out in human form through someone that we know. And yet she had been through a lot in her life. Like for me, it was easy to write religious people off as either people whose lives weren't very challenged or who just grabbed a quick out. But she seemed to be neither one of those. At that time, I began reading particularly anti-Christian literature, things like Bertrand Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian, just to be able to in quotes, win my side of the argument with her, you know. But she and her pastor were very patient, especially her pastor, because Diane was a new believer and didn't know a ton of answers. But her pastor, this man would literally drive an hour one way to come sit with me and spend 2 or 3 hours studying the Bible. And that alone impressed me. By the time I had come to a place where I began hiding that I was reading the Bible, I wouldn't let friends know. I wouldn't let Diane know. I'd become convinced that everything he was saying was true. And it was very hard for me to put an objective measure on that. I had this pause, though, because I felt like my life had been so sideways that I couldn't possibly be on Team God at this point. And I remember him opening the Bible and saying, Ed, I want you to read this. And it was Paul saying to Timothy that it's a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptation that Christ Jesus died for sinners, of whom I am the foremost. And he said, son, I don't know what you think you did, but you're at best the silver medalist in this thing. And that was the night we prayed for me to receive Jesus.
Yeah, and that's such an amazing story. It always fascinates me, the roads that we are on, that God somehow weaves back to Christ. And it just shows us that, with man, everything is impossible. With God, all things are possible. How does this connect with your call to ministry? Could you fill in the gap between that moment and then the moment where you felt like, hey, I need to dive in and serve the Lord vocationally?
I never had much trouble being an all or nothing at all guy, right? There are some things salvation changes, some things it just redirects, and that's who I was. So without exaggeration, and it's not something I do today, but I was reading the Bible 3 to 5 hours every day when I first became a believer. I was just devouring it. And I was caretaking an old 18th century home in the Northeast. My wife and I were living there and kind of building it back up and taking care of the grounds. And as long as I did the stuff for the day, I could read the rest of the day. And in one of her pastors and then my pastor's visits to the home, his wife came with him and pulled my wife aside and said, I just want to warn you, you're going to have to hold on tight when this catches with this young man. And very quickly, as a guy who had searched for the meaning of life in the midst of a world that seemed so void of anything that didn't end up in a graveyard or a junkyard, when I had found it, I couldn't understand another way to live, to be honest with you, Ronnie, except to make it my commitment for the days that I had. If it was true, that's all that there was. And I could only think of men and women who were suffering like I was as a young man in my childhood, teens, and 20s, wondering why and where and how do all these things come together and make sense. So for me, very early on, I thought, I just need to tell people about Jesus. There seemed to be so few of the kind of Christians who talked about the Bible in a way that made sense, let alone brought people to Jesus.
By this time, Ed's understanding of the Bible and life direction were becoming clearer, and his call to ministry was being met and realized through the help of the Spirit and his local church. He went on to finish degrees at the Summit University in Pennsylvania and Dallas Theological Seminary. But being away from his home also clarified his desire to go back to the Northeast and plant a church among the people he identified with most through his own story in Albany, New York.
I mean, being drawn to that in general was, I think, the way that we just sort of can easily look at the story of our lives as the story of others' lives near us if we live with some empathy. I just knew there were thousands of hurting people like I was, right? That angsty Generation X kid who just couldn't find a meaning to life and hanging out in the dark corners of punk rock clubs and reading at the open mic poetries. That's literally who I was at that point in my life. And I could see all those people and I thought, there's no Christians coming in here. Just to give you an idea of the gap that existed, our church referred to the area where that club was, which was Lark Street. It was sort of Albany's microcosm arts district, as Dark Street, right? There wasn't, not feeling a lot of love when you hear that. And I thought, those are my people. No one's speaking to my people. And I think sometimes well-meaning Christians, in an effort to bring people to safety and security in Jesus, have this phrase that ends up being a very anti-missionary phrase when you hear it, that someone got saved out of something versus someone was saved of this people or something along those lines, right? So for me, I couldn't stop thinking about my tribe, man. I mean, I just knew nobody was having the Jesus conversation with them. I mean, for me, the guy that I most identified in the New Testament when I read it was the demoniac of the Gadarenes. Here's a guy, if you're hairy, naked, chained in a graveyard because your friends can't help you, nobody has an answer, at least that you can feed on. And then like that, he's clothed and in his right mind. And I felt like that guy in some ways. It felt like my life turned from just constant death and on a saltless cracker every single day to this vibrant joy. I mean, it was amazing to even think back on it. And when Jesus said to that man, go back and tell the people of your towns what great things God has done for you. I mean, he just wanted to jump on the boat and be with the apostles and Jesus. I think he would have stitched a fish patch on the back of his tunic if he was allowed to, and just ended up in the holy huddle. But Jesus said to him, no, you now steward over a story that they will understand because they know you. And that was part of me wanting to go back there.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And, it's interesting because church planting and church planters, right, it has to start really with planting one church in a local context. And then for some people, and obviously we're talking about you right now, God takes that experience and he expands it. And so not only are you planting a church in your local context, but he's given you the reach to be a part of organizations now that are just planting across the nation or even the world. And that has been your experience. Can you give our listeners just some insight into how church planting kind of blossomed, in your life? It's not just something you did one time, but now you've been a part of it as a movement and also really a movement in your own life, right?
Yeah. I just knew when we came back to Albany, there were not churches that I thought would really reach people that I knew. And so when we started our first church called King's Chapel, just south of the city of Albany, in that first suburb south of it, it was everything I had thought the men that I deeply admired as seminary professors would have wanted. It wasn't necessarily what I would have planted. It was what I thought the church should be. If I sent you a picture, you would get it immediately. It's a white steepled church right near the four corners of the town. I mean, it couldn't be more from a nostalgic view of American Christianity. But that church still wasn't going to reach the people that I had run with before conversion. So we were really wrestling, my wife and I, with what can we do? What should have been different? Like every church planter at some point will wrestle with. And at the same time, a Baptist group, the Conservative Baptists, said, we loved the way you planted this church. We would love for you to run our church planting for the Northeast. And that was a very different road for us. One, I found it surprising because like so many people, I could be my own worst critic. And I thought this isn't all it should have been. And I wasn't a patient man when I was young. I think I didn't want to go through iterative learning. I just wanted to get it and do it right, which I don't know where I thought that was ever going to happen because it never happened in my life before. But we began that journey. And as part of that journey, I got such a great gift from them. I said, guys, I need at least half a year to just run around the country and see what's going on church planting wise. So we ended up planting a second church with Acts 29 called Terra Nova. And Terra Nova does not meet in a white steepled building on a village green. It's in a former shirt collar factory in downtown Troy. That was a nightclub when we started meeting. But that was a place where I could see the change happening that we had hoped for as missionaries to North America. The first Easter Sunday there, a woman came up to me and said, I just want you to know I'm not a believer. I'm probably an atheist, if anything, but any church that would meet in my club, I want to go to that church.
Wow. That's
so
amazing.
In those 10 years, I was running Terra Nova and being the Northeast director for Acts 29, this brand new kind of organization in Northeast. We were their first Northeast church. And by the grace of God and working with so many people. And I got to tell you, as I look back, there was a unique breaking down of parochial denominational barriers that had hindered the Northeast for at least 100 years. People were now working together who couldn't seem to find a way to do that before. And we saw 65 churches planted over those 10 years in that one region from multiple sources. And, it's not, I was there and I know some groups like to take credit. It wasn't just an 829 thing. If it wasn't for the Baptist groups who were putting in, the Presbyterian groups who were putting in, the independent churches who were putting in, we really were a para-organizational group that was helping these guys do what they were doing a little bit better.
Why is church planting so vital of all of the different sort of avenues the church can be pursuing? And there's many, and we should be pursuing many of them. Why is church planting something that you feel so convictional about?
Yeah. So I think if we think as missionaries and not churchmen about North America, it makes the answer to that a little bit easier and clearer. if we just look at as churchmen, we're going to say, what was our best day? Where did we do it well, right? And we're going to look back, depending who we are. If we're fundamentalists, we're going to go to the 20s through 50s. If we're evangelicals, we're going to look at the 70s through 90s. And we're just going to try to do from the rear view mirror what was done and try to figure out how do we do it plus. Where I think we're actually in a bit of a new frame of reference where we have to say, this is the post-Christian world that was being talked about for the last 25 years. We've arrived. And it's a world of faster change than we'd ever imagined before. If change happens at the rate of the movement of ideas and people, we're in a hyper change that the world never imagined before. So if we're going to build churches that reach these people, they have to be churches aimed at, built for, and in the 21st century. They can't, in almost any way, except going back to first century stuff, be a tribute to the past. And so that's why I think church planting is critically important. There's going to be too many people who don't clear the hurdle of what culturally church was even 50 years ago, who are being born or 20 today. They're just not going to get there. So we have to kind of build from the fabric of the 21st century, bring the gospel into those structures, and plant for the 21st century out of that.
In the fall of 2020, Ed was approached by Dave Owens, the executive director of Harbor Network, about bringing his joy and conviction of church planting to the network. But if you're like me, you might be thinking, why now? Why leave something that seems to be comfortable and bearing fruit? What drew him and invited him into the mission of Harbor Network? His answer may surprise you.
When you stand back and you're at a unique vantage point as you're stepping into Harbor Network, as you are sort of standing back and you are coming in, what do you see about Harbor that is, whether it's surprising or encouraging or very inviting to you, would you say?
The very first thing, and it's sometimes these things seem like the obvious things to say, but if we don't say the obvious things, boy, are we in trouble in a short time. Harbor unapologetically loves Jesus and believes that he is seen best through the church and the scriptures. And that is a big first step, right? That may, to people who are inside, oh, that sounds obvious. We never want to stop saying that. And I love that that's a of who Harbor is. There's a common DNA about mission and seeing the world as a pack of St. Paul's for the 21st century that is common between where I kind of learned that in the Acts 29 network and where Harbor has that DNA via Sojourn and those early days with Acts 29. So almost like a colony that splits off on its own. There's so much unique, right? It's Australia and America aren't the same just because they came from the British Isles. Harbor and Acts 29 are certainly not one for one. And the thing that was a surprise, and not in a way that I expected it not to be there, but just saw what I didn't expect to be there, was how much care there is for pastoral families and how every single pastor and wife I would speak to would bring that up again and again. That every mission group will say this because it's just the right Bible thing to say, that we're going to take care of our church planters and pastors. But not every planter, pastor, missionary will say, boy, do they really take care of us. And I could see that both structurally in words, but also, and most importantly, in that peer relationship of pastors within Harbor. And I thought this is kind of special. So that's the surprise piece that was there, was how realized what most of us have as a goal, how mature that was in Harbor.
Yeah, and I think what's encouraging for our pastors and wives and leaders to hear you say that is that, you know, for those of us who've been in the network a long time, we can just assume things, or we can just be in a place where we've been around it so much that we become slightly inoculated to it. And so obviously one of our goals and desires at Harbor is just what you described, right? We want to offer safety and support for pastors, wives, leaders. The end goal is to launch, lead, multiply, thriving churches. What does a thriving church look like to you?
So when there is a passion for Jesus, again, we can't overstate the most important things. We can't pretend the big E on the eye chart isn't there, because if we don't see the big E on the eye chart, we are blind men and women. And to see a healthy church that really loves Jesus first, where you can walk in and the hymns actually have an intelligent and passionate Christology to them. They're not just hymns that you find yourself swaying to and you think, well, that's catchy. Wait a minute, where am I, in church? Or is this someplace else that I'm just listening to catchy music? To me, that's a critical piece. When I see on a micro level what I see in the macro and Harbor, where people love one another, where that mantle isn't just a call that we need to do this and we need to change and we need to make sure we're living that out. As communities around us fracture in this world, the church becomes more and more that important place. As family breaks, as economy breaks, as government breaks, as the art and creative world breaks, the church will become the desperately welcomed home that so many people have ached for, like me, before I was a convert, to be able to find a place where these saints on earth live differently. So that's critical. The last piece that I think is the most wanting piece is we need to be people, and I'm going to be careful with the words, who both love and serve the people and times that we live in. It doesn't mean that we have to love all that we see as going against the ways of God. But if we can't love those people and love them in a way that makes sense to them, we're not following Jesus, right? If we're not the new American missionaries, if the world is where it looks like it's going, new dark ages for North America like it was in Europe, the people who reached out and re-evangelized Europe were the converts of people like St. Patrick, were barbarian converts. It wasn't the well-heeled Christians. It was the men and women who understood that culture and saw Jesus and were able to say, I need to reach them. I understand them. I'm not afraid of them. And I fear for the church sometimes that we sort of live at that crossroads constantly of, are we going to hide from this world that's frightening, potentially hurtful, and we don't understand? Or are we going to risk moving out of a very safe, isolated bunker and say, we can take Jesus out into the playground of ideas? He's going to be okay. Like, I promise you that. Jesus is going to be okay in the marketplace of ideas.
Yeah, that's good. How do you see Harbor poised to address some of those cultural issues that you just kind of touched on?
So, and this is part of what I think led Diane and I to say this is the right opportunity. There's those first two pieces that are there, right? They're profoundly, narrowly, and deeply in love with Jesus through the Word. They are secure in Him in the midst of these times. They are people who are led by people who've understood what it is to love one another. That when Jesus said, they'll know you're mine because of the way you love, that means you be engaged with people and actually do that in a way that lets the world see that you care for each other in this way. And yet, at the same time, the heart, the engine is more churches, that we want to be able to plant those churches. I mean, when I see the men and women who are directors at Harbor, like literally on their knees praying, God, give us more church planters. Let us be able to be a part of your vision in this time in North America to see these churches planted. I know where passion is, right? You listen to a guy's prayer, you understand where passion is. So I see all those three things lined up well in Harbor. And I see the opportunity that Harbor has of really starting in some ways freshly, right? This is the year of rebranding. I don't know about you, Ronnie, but every now and then I have to hit stop. And in my mind, I say Sojourn Network. And then I click back over. But even that alone is to me, a statement that we're not making idols and trophies of our past, that we're really leaning into the future no matter what.
Yeah, and I think that's so well said. Man, I would love to hear from you, just as you, man, are just coming in right now. You only get to do this one time. You know, you have that moment, right? What are you most hopeful and excited about stepping into this role?
It's really, honestly, a belief in the stewardship of what God gives each of us and how He has taken me to a place where He allowed me to lead 3 different regional networks, Converge, the Conservative Baptist, and A29, the Northeast. He allowed me to see a traditional church model that we planted and we chose to and we loved and people we loved there, but see that we could also plant churches as missionaries intentionally to the people of the 21st century, especially the young in the cities that are emerging. And to see those together and see that I could leave. I mean, understand, I'm leaving a church I love and people that I love to be able to do this. And I don't do that lightly. I mean, it was with tears on both sides that I told our congregation what Diane and I were doing. But the reality is I've been a guy who's done both pastoring and church planting networks for almost my entire time of ministry. And we sat down with the Lord and came to the conclusion that it was good and best to choose one. And to be able to serve young men and women who are planting the churches that will be the fabric of this next church story of the United States and beyond, and I'm all in on that. I don't know what else I would do with my life, given what God gave me to steward over. The best way I can leverage that for the greatest return is just what I'm doing. How do I help you young men and women?
Ed, thank you so much, brother. It's so good to hear your heart and desire for church planting. We're glad to have you in the Harbor family, and I, for one, am super stoked to see what God has for you and for our church plants over the months and years to come. All right, folks, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to our show and giving us a rating and review in iTunes. If you have feedback, please email us at podcast@harbornetwork.com. We would love to hear from you. This is Harbor Network is a production of Owens Productions, produced by myself and Mark Owens. It is hosted by me and Ronnie Martin, and it's edited and mixed by Mark Owens. Our music is by Mark Wallach and Adam Blackbird. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.